So, for example, you have closing the circuit, right? So you say, some people say that turning on the light is like kindling a fire, maybe, right? You have some people that say that closing the circuit is like makab patish. You're not allowed to finish something on Shabbos, right? Some people say it's like burna. Some people say it's like building. You now have a artifact that which before was incomplete is now complete, right? You're not allowed to build something on Shabbos. You're not allowed to and you're not allowed to finish. You're not allowed to finish something even though most of it was done before Shabbos. You're not allowed to finish it. You're not allowed to put that's the makab patish, the final hammer blow, the final touch. So closing the circuit can violate Shabbos in a few different ways. So it all depends on how you look at it. It depends what the Rav says, right? If you hold that it's not a problem to complete the circuit and the only problem is turning on the light.
Part of the building definition.
No. But the question is closing the circuit a problem? Right? Is it the closing the circuit that's the problem? Is it moving the elevator that's the problem? Right? And depending on how you look at it, there's different ways. So that's why you can hit the switch. And because it's not a direct causation, because there's a randomizer process in there, so you may technically not be committing grama, right? It's a way to get around. You may not technically be causing it, so it's a way to get around the whole issues. That's how there's heterim, and that's how right. Even so, maybe not for all people, but let's say you have a person who's disabled and they need to use they have the heter for the electric.
Let me give an example.
Yeah.
If there was a goy here, and you say, well, I wish there was a light here. And the goy would come, you want me to turn on the light? I'll turn on the light.
Yeah.
Is that okay?
No, usually not.
Why?
You're not allowed to tell goyim to do things that are also on Shabbos.
No,
Common misconception.
He didn't tell him what to do. He told
No, common misconception. It's a common misconception that you can get around it by doing that. It's also a common misconception.
Then the goy
So
will
it's
come
not
and say,
okay. I thought it was okay.
Usually not. No, most cases not okay.
Okay, what would be the sentence that would be okay?
I don't know, but let's say it was okay. So what's the point? What's the point
The
you're
point is, you
making?
put a computer, not a goy, computer, not even a person, a computer. You talk whatever sentence, and boom. All of a sudden, computer
and therefore,
is that okay?
I don't think so.
But not for yourself.
Why? What point are you making?
You never let me do it.
You can't hit the switch either. What's the difference?
Right, because the switch. I mean, the definition of the switch.
You're saying there's an extra step in the causation, but a person doesn't count as an extra step because there's specific dinim against people. So you have to look at the randomizer works better than telling a person, believe it or not. The randomizer halachically is a further halachic step than talking to another person because the talking to the other person is itself asur midrabanan, right, from the Gemara. So talking to another person is not a way out, as a specific case. You understand what I'm saying? As a technicality, talking to other people doesn't work. So it turns out that actually using the randomizer is a further step away. It's further for you to touch the button and have a randomizer that does the actual act that's against Shabbos, if that's what's taking place, than you asking a non-Jew to do it. Because you asking the non-Jew is itself forbidden. You understand what I'm saying?
Yeah. So what happens today when you get Alexa? What happens today when you got something like Siri or Alexa? Okay, that's connected up to your whole house. And you say, I'm feeling cold, and Alexa decides, okay, it's cranking up the heat.
It doesn't work. I don't know. It's a fair point. I don't know if they've asked the Rabbanim about the voice-activated stuff. They probably have. In fact, nowadays a lot of Rabbanim write the books before anyone asks them the question, right? They see what the new technology is. It's an exciting area always. Okay.
Which timers in general, or
no, timers are fine. They're set before Shabbos. We're talking about on Shabbos. This is before timer set from before Shabbos. A whole different.
Right.
Yeah, timers are good.
People say a timer for a coffee maker is okay.
I don't know.
Yeah.
I doubt it.
As long as you're not turning.
I don't know, but I don't think so. I've never heard of such a thing. I don't know.
Cooks in Shabbos.
I don't know. I'm not an authority on the laws of Shabbos, believe it or not, but I don't think. I have a feeling it's no good.
Drink coffee?
Yeah, not to drink it, to make it on Shabbos. If you make coffee here, right, you can pour the hot water directly on the coffee. That's
in
cooking.
the second glass, right?
So if you start this thing and it's now pouring hot water through the ground.
Don't think that's good. Yeah, but the question is whether you're the one doing it, right? Theoretically, you're saying it's a timer, so what difference does it make? If you're not allowed to turn on a light and you're not allowed to cook coffee, but timing makes the light okay, so the timer should make the coffee okay, I don't know.
I get that a bit. That's a better question.
That's what he's asking. I don't know. Okay.
Where are we?
So now that the halach is easy, now we go to the difficult. Things, right? So I highly recommend, if anyone's interested in Hilchos Shabbos and they want to learn English, that's a very good set. I highly recommend it. It's called the 39 Malachos. You can Google it. It's a very good set. It has drawings and illustrations. And it goes through by all right. There's 39 categories of things that are forbidden on Shabbos. You can look at the Shul's copy, and it goes through all of the the 39 things that are forbidden on Shabbos, and it explains all the modern applications. And it also has a very extensive index in the back, where you can look things up. Like you could look up coffee maker and see what he says, and all the footnotes are in Hebrew. So yeah, something for when he likes that. Okay.
And how did the shul get that said?
That's a good question. I don't know. Okay. We are on page 218 in English. We actually stopped right in the middle of something. All right, if you recall, we're discussing how it is, right? We've solved, so to speak, depends how you look at it, but we've solved one of our difficult problems. You could say maybe even our more difficult problem, depending on how you look at it. We've solved the harder problem of how God has a relationship with the world of Atzilus, right? We've explained how there can be such a thing as God's knowledge, which is defined and limited, and yet it is actually God's knowledge. And so too with all the other divine attributes, such as God's love, right? God's severity to punish someone, right? And we've explained how these things are both limited, and yet and yet they are still godly. And the explanation is because they have a vessel which provides the limitation, and the vessels are the constraint and are totally united with God's light, which is of His infinite light and a pure expression of God Himself, and therefore we can have such a thing as God's knowledge. That's, so to speak, the hard problem. The slightly easier problem is, so how does this now, which is still not limited or understandable in terms of our world in any way, right? We have something, the God's knowledge or God's kindness, as we've discussed at length, is not something you would even recognize as knowledge or kindness if you went to the world of Atzilus. It is an infinite expression of God, and therefore it's not something that we can even understand. We spoke last week at great length about how this is what the Rambam describes as the knower, the knowledge, and the known, right? You have an expression of God which is totally unlimited and is specifically not something that the human mind can grasp at all. So Atzilus, as these things are in the world of Atzilus, as you have God's knowledge, it is actually beyond our understanding and grasp at all. All we know is that it is a at least to some extent limited, or we should say defined is maybe the better word, is a defined expression of godliness, right? In other words, these things do have a vague relationship to us as opposed to God's true infinitude, which is totally and completely beyond our conception. And these things actually are the source for everything that's in our world. We know that these 10 sfirot, these 10 building blocks of light and vessels, are what goes on to create our world. So the question becomes, how do these things end up relating to us? How do you get from God's kindness in the world of Atzilus to His actual kindness as He expresses it to you in the lower worlds? Or so to speak, all of the kindness that we receive, because as we know, all of the kindness and all of the blessing that we have comes from God. In fact, everything in the world obviously comes from God, but here we're specifically talking about God's kindness as an example. So let's say all of the blessings a person receives in life comes from God's kindness. So the question becomes, how does God's kindness, which is totally beyond comprehension and beyond recognition, how does that reach us in the lower worlds? And we explained that it has to go through all the lower worlds. There's the highest world of Atzilus, where you have this godly expression which is united with Him, and then it comes down through the 3 lower worlds, or categories of worlds, as we described them last week. You have Bria, Yetzira, and Asiya, right? The world of creation, the world of formation, and the world of action. And these are the 3 spiritual worlds, the 3 spiritual realities that God's kindness comes through before it reaches us, before it is low enough to be able to come into our world as something we could even grasp, right? I should note that as something we can even grasp is not arbitrary, right? In other words, you might wonder, so what if we can grasp it or not? Right? In other words, give me kindness that I can't grasp. In fact, we say that this happens, and we don't like it, because when it's kindness we can't grasp, we actually perceive it as non-kindness and as severity. And this is part of Chassidus' explanation as how no unkindnesses come from God. Right? What we see as severity, what we see as not kind from God, part of that lack of understanding comes from the fact that there are kindnesses and expressions of God which are too great for the world to really receive. But beyond that, let's say even if that weren't the case, right? The point is, if God wants to give me kindness and He can give it to me on His terms, godly kindness, so why shouldn't He give me that, right? Who cares what I can comprehend? I'll take God's kindness, right? One might think. And the answer is that on the contrary, what we can comprehend, it very much has to do with the nature of our world. The 2 things go together. The separation between what we can comprehend and the nature of our reality is really not such a big separation. In other words, what we can comprehend is itself reflective of the nature of our reality. In other words, the very fact that our reality exists in a limited way and is separate from God, right? And God is concealed within it, and it's created with physicality, which is itself another concealment over God, in addition to everything else. That the world is actually physical, and you have all of these things and all these, so to speak, concealments over God. That and the way that our mind perceives things are interrelated, right? Our mind, the way we think, is in many ways comes from within this world, right? What we perceive, the way we see things, what we can appreciate, so to speak, is reflective of what our world can withstand and still remain our world, right? Because if you remember, the whole condition of our world's creation is that God should be concealed to a certain extent. So in other words, the idea that if God revealed His true kindness, our world would not be separate from God, and the idea that if God revealed His true kindness, we would not understand it, are really the same idea, in a way, right? Or two sides, or two reflections of one truth, right? Again, the fact that if God, number one is if God revealed His kindness in this world, we wouldn't appreciate it, His kindness as it is. And number two, that if God revealed His kindness within this world, the world would be nullified, would be bottled to God. The world would not be separate from Him in the way that it needs to be. Right? These two things are profoundly related. In other words, what we can understand is according to the amount of godliness that our world can handle and still remain separate from God as it needs to be, right? And what we can understand and that limit are closely interrelated. So it's not a technicality when we say that how can God give over kindness as we can understand it. It's on the contrary. In other words, it's a must. It's in order for our world to actually be our world as it is, which is a must, because God wants this world to exist as He is totally concealed within it. So in order for this world to be in such a way that He's completely concealed within it, His kindness must be withheld. It must be brought down from Atzilus, where it actually is godliness. And as we've been explaining, it's like it's part of God. It's God's body, we say, right? If you could say such a thing, so to speak, right? It's metaphorically God's body in the world of Atzilus. It's not Him, but it's unified with Him in a profound way, like the body is unified with the soul. If such a thing were to come into our world would simply cease to be our world. It wouldn't be our world.
So our body, Chesed?
All the 10 spheres, right? As we say on Erev Shabbos, God forbid to say God has a body. I don't mean to say literally.
No, I thought you were
That's the metaphor. No. All 10 spheres, metaphorically, right? It says we read it on Erev Shabbos. Chesed is the right arm and Gvura is the left arm, right? The whole thing. The point is not God forbid that God has a body, which we would know that it's not talking about God Himself anyway, because it's the world of Atzilus, as we've been explaining. But God has a certain expression of Himself. The world of Atzilus is nullified to Him as the body is nullified to the soul. Right? That's basically what we've been discussing. So in order for our world to be our world, by definition, that full kindness, as it is in the world of Atzilus, that highest expression of godliness, cannot make it down here. It has to be brought down. Right? And as to the question of why does that kindness have to be brought down? Why doesn't He just make our world anew? We've already answered that question, right, in previous chapters. If you'll remember, the whole point is that the God wants it to take place through a process, which is something that I attempted to explain one other time. It's not the easiest thing in the world to explain. It's not the easiest thing in the world to understand in the first place. The point is that God wants this to take place in a systematic and a process, through a process, through a systematized way. It's based on the same principle. The explanation is based on the same principle. It has to do with, in order for our world to be our world, it can't be created directly from God, right? And if you can say anything can be directly created from God, because God can do anything, on the contrary, the fact that it was created in a way of God can do anything, maybe that itself is in a contradiction to what our world needs to be, right? If our world in some way reveals that God can do anything, maybe God isn't really concealed here as much as we thought, right? So our world has to be not created in a way of God can do anything. It has to be created in a way of process, because process is really what underlies nature, right? And the whole idea of what conceals God in our world is the presence of nature. And the process, maybe the process of creation, we could say, is maybe necessary to the creation of the world. Take it with a grain of salt. I don't know if that's true. I don't fully understand the concept myself. That's my very superficial understanding of the answer to that question. But we have spoken about it before. If some of that should sound vaguely familiar, we have spoken about that before in this class. Okay. So what's it like? The Tzemach Tzedek is going to give us the metaphor. If you remember last week we ended on the cliffhanger. We didn't say what the metaphor is. What's the metaphor? What's the metaphor for? The metaphor is for what? How is it? How does the world of Atzilus? We're on page 318. Va'al derech mashal in the Hebrew. Vav ayin dalid chipchuk mem. Va'al derech mashal. Hebrew chipchuk diktuk shakshuka. We're giving a metaphor for the relationship of the world of Atzilus to the lower worlds. How is it that this world, where God's kindness is infinite, goes on to create kindnesses, as we explained last week, in the lower three worlds, which are much more like where we are, right? There's a division. There's the first one, and then there's the lower three, which are usually parceled together because they're more similar, because there's a step-by-step process of creation that takes place in those three worlds rather than a whole new thing. That's why the second world is called Bria, because it's a creation, from the Hebrew word for creation, it's a creation of something new, right? There between Atzilus and Bria, there's this gap, because the highest world is still godliness, whereas Bria, starting from the second world, you have an independent creation, right, with an independent existence to some extent. So in the lower, how does this kindness of God in the highest of worlds, in godliness, go on to affect, what is its relationship with the kindness of God in the next three worlds? In other words, how does it come down to a level where it's even ready to be in our world? Pardon?
Just something you said there got me thinking. The three worlds?
Yes.
Plus our world?
No, our world is not a plus. Our world, yeah, but go on. What's the...
Were they all created at the same time?
Yes and no, I suppose. I don't know. That's a good question.
Going back to creation.
I don't know how to answer that question.
It's beyond time.
It's beyond time. It's not beyond time. There's a spiritual concept of time. I'm not sure.
Well, why would it Bria then?
No, the question is, when we said Bereshit bara, does it mean that he created this world or created something else as well? I mean, what does it mean?
Right, we've had that question before.
At a time.
I should really have a better answer to that
Is it
question.
the Bria world as well? Because we're part of that creation then.
To some extent.
We delay.
NASA is looking our seriously. I mean, so they're ad in the newspaper. They're looking for alien expert. NASA is going to hire an alien. So maybe that's part of the...
I don't know about time. I can't answer that question. I don't know. If they were
An alien
created at the same time.
Seriously.
One is prior to the other, but that doesn't mean they're created at different times. You understand? In other words,
It's a different
the laws of physics are prior to this table, but the laws of physics and the table were not created at the same time. Right? You understand what I'm saying? So in a similar sense, the higher world is prior to the lower world. Right? In other words,
the
it's
table was developed in the physical world.
but the laws of physics are also in the physical world.
Yeah.
But the laws of physics don't need the table, but the table needs the laws of physics. You understand? That's what I'm saying. So the Bria, the higher world, the lower world needs the higher world. The higher world doesn't need the lower world, so to speak. In the process of causation, it's a causal process. We're saying
The two must be interlinked, otherwise what you create...
they are definitely interlinked, but the question is, do they precede each other in time?
If there's no lower world.
But do they precede each other in time is the question.
Well, this one wouldn't have come after, or before Bria,
But the thing
question is,
even the higher world, it is
using our
still in this
terminology
world.
of time.
There's no higher world. I mean, this is the world. It's not like, there's another world
No,
which is
I
out there.
understand that.
This is it.
Okay, we're on page 218. This is the metaphor. This is the metaphor for how Atzilus, for how the highest of the four spiritual worlds affects the lower worlds. Derech mashal. To explain with an analogy, ba'adam hakas shehu belev. You have a person who's angry. Where is anger? Anger is in the heart, right? In other words, anger is a physical feeling you have in your body, I think is the point that we're trying to say. B'charanaf gashmihu explained it's expressed as physical, literally physical nose flaring is the literal translation. But charanaf is a phrase that's found in the Chumash itself, right? It says charanape, the fury, rage. It's a metaphor for rage when a person's nostrils flare, right? The anger in the heart. Anger is an emotion, which is a physical. There's a certain physical sensation that a person feels, as I'm sure everyone can relate to, which is then expressed in an actual physical. There's a certain emotion someone feels, which is then expressed in a physical feeling. rage. And it is from this physical rage that a person has, from which the actual law and punishment is handed out. Punishment for the person you're angry to. In other words, a reaction. Someone does something to enrage you. You have an emotion. You have a physical feeling, and the physical feeling actually leads to physical action in the physical world. And you can say that it's the person that caused your action, right? To an extent, you can say such a thing. You could say you can't say they caused the action. Maybe you could say they caused the anger, at least, right? Because in Chassidus the branch across the tracks, the part where you're supposed to be in control, is after the emotion is aroused, right? Emotions being aroused is somewhat inevitable, at least for most people, right? The fact that the emotion should be present, someone does something that really irritates you, the fact that you should feel irritated is not necessarily something you can control, very difficult. What you're supposed to do is you're supposed to push away the thoughts of the anger and the feelings of the anger, and you're supposed to control yourself in thought, speech, and action, right? Which is not easy to do. It's also not easy to do, but there's levels of not easy, right? There's things which are nigh impossible, and then there's things which are... and not every case of someone angering you is obviously going to be the same, right? Because commensurate to what they do is the power of the emotion. And that's not to say that anger is always negative either, right? I think that's also too simple. I think some people in our time might take it a little too far. Anger is a very negative trait, right? Sometimes, perhaps there's a use for it. I don't know, I'm not an authority. The Rambam says anger is to be avoided. In fact, the Rambam says that anger is one of the things that you're not supposed to have moderation in. The Rambam says most things in moderation, but anger you should try and run away from to the furthest extent. So I'm not going to argue with the Rambam. The Rambam says that anger is it's not like I have a choice, so to argue like as if me arguing with the Rambam would make a difference. But the Rambam says that anger you're supposed to flee from to the greatest extent possible. Anger is a very negative emotion. So you have a person does something to you, right? That action inspires an emotional response. The emotional response creates physical sensations. I think that the emotion and the physical, from at least from how it's written here, I think it's supposed to say those are two different things. Right? In other words, the emotion is still spiritual to some extent, right? We should probably preface with the idea, if anybody is unaware, that according to Chassidus, a person is comprised of a soul and a body, one of which is spiritual and one of which is physical. Right? I think that's fairly fundamental. Sometimes in the fundamentals we skip it out. We don't think about the fundamentals enough. Right? It's the fact a person, right? It's kind of an important fundamental, especially from what a lot of people. How the modern world understands a human being is not the same as the way Chassidus understands a human being. So it's very important to have that demarcation and be aware of it. And in fact, once you become aware of it, it becomes impossible to miss it in the modern interpretations of what a person is, because it's over and over and over again. You have the message that a human being is purely physical. It's never been proven, I think, but it's in fact I know. But it is a message that you hear all the time, right? A person reduces to their brain, or a person reduces to some sort of physical being. A person just is their body. And Chassidus is of the opinion that a person is not just their body. A person has a body and a soul, and the two interact in a very complex way. It's not just a body and a soul as two. It's not a body. The truth is, not a body and a soul as two separate entities. It's a body and a soul as one entity. And the entity is neither physical nor spiritual. It is a physical/spiritual thing called a person. Right? It's not that it's not like the ghost in the machine either, right? That's a whole other mistake. It's of the Enlightenment. I don't want to go into the whole philosophy. There's no point in filling your head with things that aren't true. The bottom line is that it's number one, a person is definitely not just a body. Number two, a person is it's not like a disembodied soul. It happens to be within a body, in other words. It's not like there's a little magical thing that's inside of you that's like a Power Ranger, or like a marionette, right? Like it's moving the body. There's like a separate body and a separate soul. So you have the body, and then you have a thing inside the body, which is not the body, which is controlling the body. That's not what it is either. It's both of the things together. You have a body and a soul, and a person is both of these at the same time. A person is neither physical nor spiritual. There's a soul in the body, and they're together as one being is a person. And the way
The
that
computer and the software.
So when somebody, God forbid, dies, it's not a person anymore because the soul left him.
to some extent, yeah, sure,
Which is very true.
sure.
It's only a body. It's like nothing.
It's a body. It's a body. It's not a person. We treat bodies with a lot of respect, but it's not. In many senses, it's not a person. No.
And the body will disappear. So what is left? The skeleton.
You're right.
The Rebbe Rashab actually writes, is just as a side note, and I'm going to make trouble now because I'm going to say the question and then I'm not going to say the answer. But the whole point is, the Rebbe Rashab says, very interesting, that the whole notion that the body continues to exist after the soul has departed is itself something which needs explanation. It's rather a strange thing in the Rebbe Rashab's opinion. The Rebbe Rashab says, theoretically, you'd think that the two would disappear together. Why does the body continue after the soul is gone? That's a whole thing, but it's interesting. It's interesting to think about.
What do you mean the body continues?
Physical part.
What?
The soul leaves.
Yeah, but the
there's a
thing
body
is,
lying here.
the thing is that the person is both, right? In other words, if you understand this idea that the person is both, as they're united, it becomes very strange to think of the two as separate.
But if you take a glass, you break it. The material is still there. Is it a glass? No, it's not a glass anymore.
Right. There's. I hear what you're saying. I hear what you're saying. The point is though, okay, so say that even if you say that the matter remains, right, maybe it should decompose instantly, right, even further. I think that's actually a point that Rabbi Rashab makes, now that you pointed out, right. Let's say, so even if the matter has to remain indefinitely, right, because you say ultimately the soul's spiritual, so where should the matter go, right? The matter is not going to convert to spirit, the matter should remain. So a person should decompose instantly, a person passes away, and the body should fall to nothing. What's this?
Who said that? 4 years or whatever time it takes for that
For the body to decompose, yeah, that's part of the.
Tzemach was never decomposed.
It's also a good point. I don't know. It's fair point. There's a luz bone, which according to the Jewish tradition, and I'm not sure, I don't know what biology says or anything like that, but according to the Jewish tradition, does not decompose, and that's the part of the body that the body is recreated from. Yeah, when Mashiach comes, that's the part of the body. The bone is what the rest of the body is created from, which is very interesting, if I'm not mistaken, because I think some of the in the base of the spinal cord by the skull is actually where I think they get the stem cells from. No, if I'm not mistaken, so it's in the little hip as well. So maybe at different ends maybe it's the other end of the spine. I may be mistaken, but I thought maybe that some of the bones up here is where they get the stem cells from. No. Interesting. I may be wrong. Maybe at the base of the spine, like down here. I may be mistaken. I don't know.
It's in the hip bone.
Yeah, so I may be wrong.
I was looking at stem cells.
In any case, so you have a spirit and a body, and the two are united as a person. When a person does something to make you really angry, you get cut off in traffic, right? So you can't say the person's responsible for you rear-ending them on purpose and driving them off the road, right? Which is what the natural response when someone cuts you off on the highway. But they don't cause your action directly, not exactly, right? Because you have control over your actions. But they do cause the anger, right? The person cuts you off on the highway, they cause the anger. The anger is a certain feeling, and it's that feeling which, so to speak, drives the response, right? Even though a person ultimately has choice, and that makes the whole matter a little bit complicated. But the bottom line is that the feeling is what in many cases drives the response, right? In other words, there's a certain cause and effect taking place. There's a causal chain. A person does something to make you angry, that affects your soul, there's a part of your soul which has the ability to feel anger, the emotive part of your soul. You feel an emotion of anger. The emotion of anger concurrently or immediately causes a physical reaction. You have a physical anger that you feel, and then there's your response, which is an actual thing, you go on to actually affect the physical world in response to that, right? You react to your anger, you punish them, you mete out punishment. If you, like, for example, you strike someone with your hand because of this, or you command someone else to do it, right? So he's saying there's a reaction there's an effect of your anger either in action or in speech, right? Which are two of our three things that the person controls, right? Which he's emphasizing. I think that the emphasis here is that it's one of the lower ones. It's not just in your thoughts, which theoretically the point is, I think, that your thoughts still stay within you, right? Your thoughts are private. Your thoughts are self-contained, right? Even though we say that a person has control over their thoughts, it's a whole thing in Chassidus. The thought, speech, and action are, so to speak, the garments of the soul. One of the reasons they're called garments is because they can be exchanged, right? You can decide what to do. You can't, so to speak, exchange your body, at least not with current medical technology, And even then, the question of whether it's actually your body is an interesting question. Even halachically, it may not actually, these things are very unlikely to be considered your body. And as for grafts and all sorts of complicated things, that's a different question.
Every morning I say Modani, actually this is because of that, I guess.
Right. Well, it's a whole, you can go, in terms of the medical stuff and the latest medical advances and halacha and Judaism, you can just go forever. It's interesting. It's all sorts of weird, interesting things that we have to deal with that we've never had to deal with before. And that's all very interesting. But I apologize, I got totally distracted. What was I saying?
The garments of the soul.
The garments of the soul. So you have the thought, the speech, and the action, which you have control over. Pardon me. You have thought, speech, and I got too excited. You got thought, speech, and action, which you have control over. The thoughts are private. The thoughts stay within the person, right? The speech and the action are external expressions. I think that's the emphasis here. The point is that you have an emotion, you have a spiritual emotion, which causes a physical sensation, a physical emotion, so to speak, you could even say, which then actually you go out and then actually act on that in the physical world. In other words, these are the lowest expressions of a person that there are. Is speech and action. These are the lowest things we do, right? You measure what's lowest by what the least internal, the least close to the essence of a person's being, to the very soul of who they are, is speech and action, right? Speech is, words, talk is cheap, that's why talk is cheap, right? Because what does a person put on the line when they speak? Really, nothing, right? Unless there's contingencies. Right, Sichas kulin shal talmidei chachamim, right? So, not everything is simple. That's the bottom line. That's the lesson. Nothing. What is simple? God is simple, right? And even that's not so simple. God is simple, and even He's not so simple. So so you have speech and action, which are the lowest expressions of the soul, right? And I say lowest is not a value judgment, as Ronnie is reminding me. Lowest doesn't mean. It's not, there's a lot of value in low things. Low things can sometimes secretly be high things. Chassidus is complicated. But when I say lowest here, I mean the least expressive of the person. If you want to know who someone really is, an insight into their thoughts would be much better than their speech. Their speech would be better than their action, right? Their actual personality would be even deeper than the thoughts that they think, right? And then you have the very essence of who they are, the very essence of the person's being, right? The person exists and there's layers. People are like onions. They have layers, right? Like ogres. So you have the action and the speech, which are external. So you have someone cuts you off on the highway. You have an emotion. You have a spiritual emotional response. You have a physical emotional response, and you have an actual speech or action, which are actual. They change the physical world. You actually have something which is impactful upon physical reality, external to the person, outside of themselves. Yeah, this is all part of the metaphor. Remember. The sheresh hakas, and where does the anger itself comes from when the person cuts you off on the highway? Hu b'meach v'seichel. It comes ultimately from the brain and the intellect. Hu b'tachlis haruchnis v'adachus, which are absolutely spiritual, and b'dachus he translated as abstract, which is a good translation. They are spiritual and abstract. Dahainu akpeda, which refers to your kpeda, which he translates here as an objection, which is also a very good translation. In your intellect, you have an objection to the action. Shurak, which means what? The fact that you cannot intellectually tolerate, you have no intellectual patience for, so to speak, this thing in your brain. But it itself is not anger. Okay, so we're adding in a new step. This is the important part to really understand. You have a intellectual assessment of what takes place, and most of us, this happens so quickly we don't even notice it as a step. Right? You have someone cuts you off on the highway. Cutting you off on the highway, you're mad instantly, right? But the truth is that you can't be mad instantly, obviously, because the emotions have no capacity to assess outside occurrences at all, right? The emotions are directed to something, but they're not. The emotion itself is obviously non-intellectual. In other words, the emotion itself has it actually has no bittul. This is really what it is. The emotion itself has no ability to actually grasp something outside of itself, right? The emotion is, in a certain sense, self-contained. Emotions arise as if from nowhere, right? Where does the emotion come from? The truth is, the emotion doesn't come from nowhere. It's just that the emotion itself doesn't know its source. Right? The emotion is animalistic in a sense, right? The emotion doesn't have intellect. The emotion can't. The emotion doesn't grasp its own source. It doesn't grasp where it comes from. It has no perception of anything outside of it. So I know I'm angry to that person, but from the perspective of my anger itself, right, where does the anger come from? And the answer is nowhere. To answer the question of where the anger comes from, you have to go to the intellect. The intellect is what gives birth. So the answer, if I ask you, what are you angry about? And you say, I'm angry because that guy cut me off on the highway. Where does the answer come from? Not from the anger itself. The answer comes from the intellectual assessment of what took place, right? I know that this took place. He cut into my lane. That's my space, right? I know that this is not what I don't like this. And the way he's saying it is in the and he's saying, and from the other end. And what if you could isolate just the intellectual assessment? Would it even sound angry? Would it speak with an angry voice? And the answer is no. Right? The actual anger starts later. The anger is emotional, but the assessment of the cause of the anger is intellectual. Right? And as we say in Chassidus, the anger, emotions are born of intellect. Right? In other words, it says Ema banim smecha, right? The mother of the children is glad. The mother is bina. The mother is in Kabbalah is always refers to bina, which is an analytic part of the soul, the ability to perform analysis, to understand things by taking them apart and understanding all the different parts of it together, right? And the emotions are born of Bina. That's why it's called the mother. It's called the mother because what does it give birth to? It gives birth to 6 children, which are the midas, right? Zah, the 6 emotional attributes. Chesed, Gvura, Tiferes, Netzach, Jesed. So emotions are born of intellect. Emotions are born of intellect, and the emotion of anger, which feels like it's instantaneous, it may be instantaneous in time, but where does it come from? All anger is born of the intellectual assessment. The intellectual assessment is where you actually understand what happened that caused you to be angry. And we're saying if you just isolated the intellect and you understood the intellect alone, the intellect's not angry. The intellect just has a kapeda, it says here. In other words, the intellect doesn't feel an emotion of anger. The intellect just knows this is not a good thing. How does he say? Lo yuchal lisbel hadavar b'meichel. This is a thing I don't tolerate. This is a no-no. You have intellectual. It's a cold intellectual assessment. Is this good thing or is this bad thing? Is this something which is tolerable or is this something which is intolerable? Intellectual analysis. Someone cuts you off on the highway, right? You imagine the world's wisest and coldest man. He's sitting there. He's thinking to himself, well, is this really tolerable? Well, I'm not sure. I don't know if I really like it, that it put me in danger. I feel like I almost crashed.
Will react completely different to the same event.
Right. There's many different parts of that. Every part of the chain, there could be something different. They could be of a different emotional quality, right? Some people are by nature just much colder in general. They don't have a lot of emotional reaction to anything.
Well, if someone lives on an island, like isolated island, he has no anger?
Of course he has anger. But look, you look at the soccer match.
He has no anger.
He has no traffic.
The other thought, I want to kill you.
Yeah, that's also true, right? Which is an intellectual thing, right? True. This is a sign that the person can assess, those are the good guys and they got the goal, or no, they're the bad guys and they got the goal. What's all of that? That's all intellectual. That's all an intellectual assessment. So the emotions are born of the intellect, okay? So this is the metaphor. Someone cuts you off on the highway, you have an intellectual response, which is not emotional. You have an emotional response, which is not intellectual, but the intellect is what gives birth to the emotions. The emotions are formed and shaped by the intellect. And then you have an actual physical response, and that physical response can actually lead to an actual action in the physical world. So in other words, we have a full systemic breakdown. This is the full system of the person. You have a reaction in the mind, you have a reaction in the spiritual emotions, you have a physical emotion, so to speak, which corresponds to the spiritual emotion, and then you actually have an action, where you actually go and do something. Yeah? Became to be our third line on page 221. Through this, we understand the way that the vessels of Atzilus are invested in the vessels of Bria, Yetzira, and Asiya. And we understand how the vessels of the highest world are invested in the vessels of the lowest world. How they affect them. How does God's kindness in the world of Atzilus, or His severity in this case for our metaphor, how would the severity of God affect the severity in the lower worlds? It is like this metaphor. In other words, it is like the way that the intellect has a relationship with the emotions. That's the metaphor here. The relationship of the intellect to the emotions is like the relationship of Atzilus to Bia. In other words, let's say you do something that angers God. God forbid. I'm just using that metaphor because anger was the metaphor that Tzemach Tzedek used. So let's say a person does something that angers God. So you have Atzilus. We say the reaction in Atzilus is totally unfathomable to us, right? We can't understand what it means, God's Gevura in Atzilus. If we saw it, we wouldn't even recognize it as that. It's an infinite expression of Gevura, of godly severity. We don't understand what that is, right? That would be like, it's only a metaphor, but it's like the intellectual reaction to doing something, right? You affect, so to speak, this is, so to speak, God's intellectual reaction. That such a thing, it doesn't fit in there. It's not tolerable. It says it's not can't tolerate it in his brain, whatever that means, right? So in other words, you're having a purely intellectual effect. The lower worlds are the way that the intellect affects the emotion. So when the intellect gives birth to the emotion, when the intellect gives birth to okay, now there's a process, a building process that actually leads to an action, right? You have, so to speak, in the metaphor, it seemed to me there are three levels. Maybe we could say there's like the three worlds. I don't know if it's a direct metaphor, so I don't want to say it directly, right? But you have stages. You have the intellectual response. The intellectual response is completely unfathomable, right? In God, so to speak, it's completely internal. Then you have the intellectual response gives birth to an emotional response. And the emotional response, again, there's this break between, we understand now, there's a break between the emotional response and the intellectual response. Even though the intellectual response gives birth to the emotional response comes from the intellectual response because otherwise to whom am I being angry, right? Or you could say by God's kindness, to whom am I giving kindness, right? The emotions would not have an answer without the intellect, so to speak, right? But the emotions are born of the intellect, and then it's a process. You have a spiritual form, you have a more physical form, and then you actually have an action of actually doing something completely outside of you, right? So you could say it's very similar to the Atzilus and the lower three worlds. You have the intellectual response, which is at a remove. It can do things. In other words, the emphasis here, I think, if I'm not mistaken, is that it can do things that the other worlds can't do at all, right? This intellectual assessment, where you can actually grasp what's taking place, and it has a certain place within the structure. It has a certain place of this is tolerable, this is not tolerable, this is good or this is bad, right? That complexity and that ability to grasp things is a total order above anything that the emotions or below can accomplish on their own, right? In other words, the intellect is a total step above, a total cut above the rest, even though it causes the rest to take place. That's the mashal, that's the metaphor. Atzilus, when God's kindness goes or severity goes through the lower worlds, it's like this process. There's an unfathomable and infinite, so to speak, reaction or causation that takes place, and then that goes down through the different levels and is expressed at a successively lower level each time, right? One time is like from the intellect to the spiritual emotion, which is still using the soul. It's still not embodied, right? It's still, in a sense, that's still very rarefied and spiritual. Then you have an actual bodily response, right? That's something which is taking place in the physical world. That's the same world that's inhabited by the person that you're going to go and give a smack, right? And then you have an actual physical reaction, which is you're going outside of yourself and actually doing something, you're actually affecting a completely different person by smacking them in the face, right? That's the lowest of the expressions. So it's a similar idea with Atzilus and the three worlds. That's the metaphor. Understand? There are myriads upon myriads, he translates, of levels of this process. In other words, don't think it's so simple. There's only 3 steps. This takes place over thousands and thousands of levels in the process of Atzilus to our world. Until the God's emotional traits, as we were explaining them before in the world of Atzilus, bring into being it eventually creates. It eventually affects something commensurate enough, close enough, not so infinitely removed that it can actually become a physical expression of God's kindness. In other words, you have God's kindness, which starts in that highest world. It comes down through these different levels, and eventually, through thousands and thousands of steps, it eventually becomes low enough that it could actually be expressed as something that could be perceived as a physical kindness. What
does it mean by thousands and thousands of steps?
There's, I explained it before, there's not really just 4 worlds, there's thousands and thousands of worlds.
But what does that mean?
What's taking place? I don't know. It's a good question. What
Like when we talk about tzimtzum, What does it mean? It's a part of filtering.
Yeah, but he's saying what's going on there? What's taking place in the thousands of worlds?
Somebody cuts you on the road.
Well, if I'm in New York, it just goes from intellect to action. You take the gun and shoot tires out.
No, first, did you eat food this morning? Get the fix everything. What happened last night with your wife?
Next to you.
Are there witnesses? Right? There's all sorts of things.
Billboards in the radio. It's a different thing. In the same, everything together. It's millions of processes.
No, impossible. No, someone else.
Was in a small car, big car.
It was a woman. Old
woman.
So hein b'chesed hein b'gvura, this takes place both with God's kindness and with God's severity. And then you have ways that the godly influence can even take place through messengers. Right, v'heina malachim, like the angels, for example. Right, when an angel comes and gives you a message. Right, the angels come famously to Avram. Right, there's 3 angels. One is there to heal him. One is there to give him the message that his son Yitzchak will be born, and one is there to destroy Sodom. Right, to destroy the angels don't get mixed up. Right, make sure that you don't switch the ones for Sodom and the one to give him the message. Right, so the angels come and each one has their own specific. It's the same thing with Gvuras and Chasadim. Right, there's severity, there's kindness. Different of these expressions come down and then are expressed through a messenger, right? Which sometimes takes place. We're saying, in other words, you're saying not always is it directly. Not always is it directly through God. Is not such a simple thing to say. The point is that it's not always. Sometimes, at least it appears. We could say that at least it appears to come through some sort of messenger with some sort of agency. What agency angels have, as I don't know. It's beyond my pay grade. I have no idea what it's like to be an angel. The kol zakadesh is gashing Hashem v'lavei be'elam hashafel. Angels don't have free choice, right? That I know. Beyond that, I don't know. And all this is in order that this flow should come into this low world, which has to be come down in a way of kavod nivra. The created honor. Normally, kavod refers to malchus in the Kabbalah. Actually, there's a footnote here. Kavod nivra, the created honor, means he's saying the malchus of malchus as it goes on into creation has to come through bria, has to come down through the lower worlds. Kavod honor, God's honor is normally referred to as malchus. Is normally means malchus in the Kabbalah. Kavod nivra, his created malchus means his malchus as it affects the lower worlds. In other words, it has to come through this process, right? That's the process we've been describing of how God's emotional traits and atzilus come down into the lower worlds. All of that's through malchus, as I think we talked about last week. So it comes down into the lower worlds through malchus. So in other words, this whole process must take place, as I said before at the beginning of this class. This whole process must take place in order that our low world should be able to receive it, right? Which is really a way of saying in order that our world should be able to remain a low world when it receives it. That's what I'm adding. That's what I added at the beginning of the class. Hein l'tev v'hen l'mutav. Both that it should be good and also l'mutav, like to do good. In other words, that it should be good essentially, and also good in its expression, right? As I was explaining before, so a lot of the things that we think that we see as negative or that we see as bad are really good that our world can't really grasp, or that we can't grasp intellectually, and all of these things. So you have so in order that the good should be good, but not just be good essentially, but also do good. In other words, be perceived as good from the outside, to do good in the world. Right, it has to come down through these contractions that we should be able to appreciate it as good. In other words,
for the donor, for the receiver.
And if we don't understand it,
yeah, what?
And if we don't understand it,
it should at least be understandable.
No, as something good, you're saying. So if it's something that happens that we perceive as,
that's actually in some cases that is a revelation which is so to speak beyond the bounds of the world as they are per se. Right? If it is actually good and we don't perceive it as such, and it comes from a place beyond the bounds of the world.
Which happens all the time.
Right. Which that's why we say that these are bigger kindnesses in a way. Right. That's we say they're not just also kind, but they come from a higher place because or they come from such a place where it's impossible to make them small enough to fit in the world in an appreciable way.
So they also come through the same.
To some extent, obviously, if anything is going to express itself as physical, it has to come through this process. But obviously, I think the idea is more like the process can't cover it all the way. The process can do enough to bring it into this world, but not enough. It's not possible to, so to speak, for such revelations to be perceived as good within this world. In other words, it's a good that needs to happen, I think, is the idea. Right? We're talking about bad things now. We're talking about things that nominally are bad. That
really bad.
We perceive as negative. Sure, someone gets a sickness,
Whatever
right?
it is,
Yeah, whatever it is. So we don't. It's a very subtle Hasidus' approach. It's not so simple, right? We're not saying that it's really a good thing and everyone should just walk around and be happy. That's not the point. The point is that this thing, which is bad and is not, there's no getting around the fact that it's bad from our perspective. This thing is bad and appears bad to us. The point is you should just know it's part of it's true. In other words, what I'm saying is the emotional and so to speak, the application of this in the service of God, I'm putting aside for a moment. How a person should react and how a person should approach this thing in their own life, I don't know. But the truth is, in other words, the fact remains that these bad things, which can happen to a person, is really an expression. And we say that evil does not descend from God. The things that come from God are only good. It's just a question of, is it a good that fits within the bounds of the world, or is it a good which totally transcends it? And by the way, there may be things which are within the bounds of the world that we personally happen to not understand. Right? There's things which we happen not to understand. There are things which are not understandable at all. Right? And we have to take it on good faith that these things are ultimately kindnesses, even though it doesn't feel that way or seem that way at all. And the point is that usually in many cases, this is a revelation which is higher than the world is able to, so to speak, bear. It doesn't appear. It's a kindness which cannot express as kindness because it's too big.
It's contradictory because it's still coming through the system. So.
To some extent, yeah. There's different aspects of the system. I don't know. It's a good point. I don't know. I wish I knew a better answer. Maybe I'll learn more and find out. Let me find a place to stop here. Lenois nechasav l'shreishe. L'hames, not try to pronounce that word. L'hames, lesser, l'chabel, v'chulu. To damage, or so God can express himself also to damage someone's property, or to uproot, to kill, to imprison, to injure, etc. In other words, these are things which also come from God. All of this is achieved through the angels of Yetzirah and Asiyah. In other words, these are also things which can be done through messengers, through angels, right, through God's messengers within the world. And Nikrois Ritzual Eloika, which are called the lash of God, or the whip of God. Shema Kruvim, Shema Krevim, Alashnuim Vaispailas Agashmi is Tachlis Akreva, which are very close to actual change and physical effect. With an utmost closeness. In other words, they're at a low level. In other words, these angels exist at such a low level that they're close enough to actually affect things in the physical world, which indicates that they're at a very low level. They're so low that actual physical change, which in the eyes of Chassidus is an unbelievably low state of being, actual physical change is within their understanding, their ability to affect. Right. So in other words, they must be very low angels. They're close to the world. Okay, I'm just going to finish two or three more lines. Sorry. El Dayane Xeris. These are the ones who judge the decrees. It says in the footnote here, these are phrases that are borrowed from the Gemara out of context. In other words, the Gemara there is not talking about angels. The Tzemach Tzedek is using it to talk about angels, right? He's saying these ones judge the decrees. Ve'el Dayane Chabalas. These ones judge the injuries. Ve'el Dayane Nefashas. These ones judge souls. In other words, capital crimes, right? They can take away someone's life and things like that. We have a concept of the angel of death in Judaism, right? Things like that. Zeh sefer v'zeh shekel, this one counts, this one weighs, etc. They count and weigh the deeds. In other words, God uses harbe shluchim l'makom. We say God has many messengers. God uses these angels to reward or to punish in an expression. In other words, what we're saying is when we say in Judaism that God uses angels to do all these things, what are we describing? We're describing really another part in this same process, right? Of the God's kindness and God's severity being expressed in the lower worlds. And obviously, the point of the angels is that they're so separate from God that they're an independent existence. In other words, this implies that they're close to us, they have a relationship they're almost like us, they're almost like creations in the physical world, and therefore they're parts of this process. The reason why it happens through an angel and not just God doing it himself is that it comes down into this world to be able to fit within this world. What's an example of God doing something himself? Punishment, very famous, right? That's right. The death of the firstborn. We say that God is specifically not through an angel, right? So you may have wondered ever sitting at the Seder, what's the difference if he does it through an angel or not, right? And the answer is this is the difference. The difference is it an expression of God as it's been brought down to make it fit within the confines of the world, so to speak, to make it something that is lafi erech, that is commensurate to the low level of the world, or is it something which comes directly from him, so to speak? And what does it mean that there can be a plague that happened within the physical world that was a miracle still, right? Perhaps that's part of what makes it a miracle, maybe for a different class. But so you have a miracle, an actual physical plague that took place in the physical world, and yet it was God Himself doing it, which means it seems it didn't go through this process at all. So you can go learn about the Makos Becheres. It means it's a very great thing, a very great revelation of godliness, right? That's the whole thing with Kechatzes Halayla. It's a whole thing, right? That's whatever, for a different time. Okay. As the Ramak writes in the 24th portal, chapter 11. You can go read in the Ramak about all these different angels and all their different jobs. Okay, so basically this last bit about angels was basically explaining how all of the angels that are mentioned in the Chumash and in the Gemara and in all these other places, what are the angels? They are part of this same process. They are steps in this process of bringing down the very abstract and very removed midas, qualities of God as they exist in the world of Atzilus, in the spheres of Atzilus, the light in the vessels of Atzilus, and bring it down into all of the lower worlds. And sometimes an angel is part of that process of bringing down that revelation to a level at which this world can suffer it, so to speak, for good or for bad. Okay, I think that's where we'll stop.